Well, a new year is now upon us. There are two major wars currently being fought, including the deadliest war in Europe since World War II, and conflict in the Middle East that predictably followed the greatest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, either of which could easily spark global conflicts. The North Koreans are saber-rattling toward the south, the Chinese have their eyes on Taiwan, and my fellow Americans are about to embark upon what promises to be the most contentious and divisive election cycle, at least since our Civil War. All of that being said, when times are troubled, many of us turn to the horror genre, sometimes for answers or to rehearse the horrifying things happening in the world, sometimes just to escape, sometimes a bit of all of the above. With that in mind, I think we can expect 2024 to deliver some pretty good horror stories. Now that we're right at the beginning of a new year, it's time for me to take a moment to look ahead at some of what the horror genre is going to be offering in the next 12 months. I'm going to talk about movies first, then books, but in both cases it's important to realize that all of this information is tentative. Dates are likely to shift, some projects might even get canceled, and I can guarantee there will be some new projects that haven't come to my attention yet, or that I've forgotten about or neglected to mention, but might nevertheless end up being some of the best books and movies of the year. Normally, I put purchase links to the books and movies I discuss on this channel down there in the What's It. Of course, this is a bit different since these haven't come out yet, so I may or may not be able to find pre-order links for some of them. Presumably some of them I will and some of them won't. But I encourage y'all to check that What's It anyway, because frankly, there's usually some good information down there. And it's also where you can find information about where to buy my own books, which helps to support my work here on this channel. But without further ado, check the What's It after this video. For now, let's start talking about the movies, followed immediately by the upcoming books for 2024. First up is a movie that's actually already out. It's been released because I didn't get this video made in the first week of the year, but schedules are what they are, and I had a different video for the new year, and it is what it is. But the movie I'm talking about is Night Swim, which came out on January 5th. And my 1-minute review has already been posted on this channel, so I probably don't need to belabor the point here. But in the interest of sort of presenting a complete listing, I'm mentioning it, and I will say it's pretty much exactly what I expected. It's the story about a haunted swimming pool that grants wishes, but at a terrible price. And yeah, it's a January horror movie, which is to say, it gets the job done, it keeps the audience entertained for a couple of hours, but it probably isn't going to change anyone's life. Next up, on January 19th, we have ISS, which of course stands for the International Space Station. The premise of this one is that Americans and Russians are peacefully coexisting on the ISS until war breaks out on the ground, and then they mutually try to fight each other to capture the space station. And I have mixed thoughts about it. It does look like a well-produced film with a impressive special effects budget and probably quite tense storytelling. And on some level, it's certainly timely considering what the Russians have been up to, particularly for the last nearly 2 years at this point. However, based on the trailers, I also question the premise. Given the scale of war that appears to be happening in the film's world, I struggle to understand why either side would really care about the ISS. It has scientific and symbolic value during peacetime, and perhaps even during small conflicts, but during what looks like nuclear world war, I simply don't understand what strategic value it would have for either of the combatants. And I also question whether the scientists and astronauts aboard would be so quick to follow orders to take control of the facility, given the relationships they'd forged with each other during peacetime. So we'll wait and see how good the film ultimately ends up being and how it handles those questions that I have. Also coming on January 19 is Founders Day, which looks a lot like a slasher film very much in the same style as last year's Thanksgiving from Eli Roth, although it looks like it also places the slashing in the context of a heated mayoral election in the small town in which it takes place. So while Thanksgiving's opening scene in particular offered some social commentary on Black Friday riots, perhaps this one is set to offer some commentary on our own upcoming election cycle. Whether I hope that's the case or not depends entirely on the softness of touch with which the filmmakers could handle it. That doesn't mean it can't be bloody as a good slasher movie should be, but when I mean a softness of touch, what I mean is that the politics, if it in fact is a political story, should be kept largely to subtext, because unless the film is specifically about a political message and specifically intended to convey a political message above and beyond anything else, and I'm thinking there of movies like Nefarious on one side, or perhaps the more recent Candyman film, if you're not doing that, and I question whether Candyman even pulled that off, then ham-fisted political commentary injected into what should be just a slasher movie could really kill a horror story. On the other hand, if the story comes first, having some political subtext could elevate the horror story, as much as I hate to talk about elevated horror, because that's a phrase that I think needs to go the way of the dinosaurs. That's a whole other thing. But it could elevate a story from just a slasher into something a little bit more thought-provoking if it's done well. Regardless, the character design of the villain in Founders Day looks pretty good, and as much as I usually prefer that more intellectual or subtle, creepy kind of horror to over-the-top, bloody slasher movies, I do still love a good, fun, bloody romp, so it should at least be interesting. On February 8th, we're going to get to see a movie called Baghead. It's one I haven't seen as many people talking about, but it's actually one of the ones I'm most excited about, at least for early in the year. And I really hope it doesn't disappoint. It looks like a kind of gothic story about a woman who inherits a house whose basement is home to an entity. That's sort of the standard setup for a gothic story. In this case, said entity appears to be some sort of shape-shifting witch who wears a bag on her head, hence the title, and has the power to give people the chance to communicate with the dead, but only for 2 minutes, at which time she takes over and things get scary. It could be really great, or it could be really cheesy, and I'm hoping for the former. We'll then get to see Lisa Frankenstein on February 9. It's a sort of romance, from the look of it, about a girl who tries to have a romantic relationship with a dead man she's reanimated. Or I guess I don't know if she's reanimated him or if he has become reanimated and she just tries to have a relationship with him. Either way, it sounds and even looks a little bit like it has some pretty heavy Tim Burton influences, but it's actually directed by Diablo Cody, whose work I have found to be of mixed quality over the years, so we'll have to see what this one ends up being like. Despite the horror themes, it doesn't really look like a horror movie, more of a dark fantasy romantic comedy perhaps, but I'm nevertheless interested to see what direction it actually goes. The very same day, we'll get a film called Out of Darkness. I don't know a whole lot about it, except that it appears to be about a band of Stone Age people. It takes place about 40,000 years ago, and these people have to contend with some kind of unspecified monster that seems to be lurking in the woods. It does look interesting though, and the people behind it have made some other good movies, so it'll be interesting to see something that maybe isn't exactly the same as what we've already seen a million times before. And then sometime in February, I'm not sure exactly which date, we're supposed to see the release of Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey 2. And this is another one about which I have very mixed thoughts. When the first one came out, I was pretty excited, not because I expected a good horror movie, or a good movie of any variety, but just because I was curious to see the product of the work of evil genius that it took to turn beloved childhood characters like Winnie the Pooh into slasher villains. And, well, it's what it needed to be. It's terrible, but it delivered exactly what it promised. And I didn't really want a sequel because I felt like the joke had already been made. But they did get more of a budget this time around, and they are introducing even more characters that have now fallen into the public domain, including Tigger. So I'll see it anyway, but let's just say I'm not as interested as I was for the first one. Also in February, there's supposed to be a German horror movie called Cuckoo coming out. But I think that February release might just be a festival release, and the wider release might be coming later. And honestly, that's about all I know about it, except that it's not to be confused with the novel Cuckoo by Gretchen Felker Martin, also coming this year, but which nobody should purchase because the author, unfortunately, recently took to Twitter to praise the 9/11 attacks in no uncertain terms. So to hell with that book and that author, but I wanted to mention that the movie has nothing to do with that crap. So if you're going to engage with one Cuckoo horror story this year, just make sure it's the right one. March the 8th brings us Imaginary, the story of a child's imaginary friend in the form of a teddy bear, who turns out to not be so imaginary after all, and in fact, not to be so friendly after all. It's an extremely familiar story. The malevolent entity as imaginary friend has been done to death in the horror genre as well as fantasy and some other things. So I can't bring myself to get extremely excited about it, but it does look like it has a pretty good shot at telling that story fairly well. And it is one of the big horror releases of early 2024. It's one of the ones whose trailers we've been seeing running against all the other movies at major chain theaters and that sort of thing. So I'll for sure at least be at the theater to see it. We're also finally going to get to see Late Night with the Devil on March 22nd. Most of you may not have heard of that film, which is okay. Neither had I until a friend saw it at a festival screening and mentioned it as one of the highlights of that festival. It's kind of a found footage movie. It's presented as a late night talk show in the style of Johnny Carson, but during the live broadcast, some supernatural evil starts to happen live on camera. So it's presented as the lost tape of this broadcast that went wrong. I have it on good authority that it's a great movie, and I for one can't wait to finally have a chance to see it. Originally scheduled for March 29, though it looks like it's been moved up to also premiere on March 22nd, is Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. And I'm all kinds of excited. I know not everyone has liked all the Ghostbusters movies, but the way I see it, the last one did exactly what it needed to do in sort of bridging the gap between nostalgia for the classic Ghostbusters films and bringing in the new characters, while also simultaneously undoing that wretched cinematic abomination from 2016. But now, it's time to see what these new characters that the last film introduced can do in a story that's more their own without relying just on the nostalgia of the previous film. So I think this will be the real test of these new films, and I'm hoping for good things as we move forward. Also, presumably, sometime in March will be Mickey's Mousetrap, the first of at least 2 Mickey Mouse horror movies, now that Steamboat Willie has entered the public domain. And I have mixed thoughts about these, just as I did with the Winnie the Pooh one that I mentioned earlier. Basically, my same thoughts apply, though I'm a little bit more excited about this one, because I'm pretty much all in favor of anyone who manages to extend a giant cinematic middle finger to the Disney Corporation that has so effectively ruined Walt's legacy. But it's also going to be interesting to see how this plays out from a legal perspective, because the character should be free and clear as belonging to the public domain. And yet, I've seen reports that Disney has still been filing copyright claims, at least on YouTube, against people using the Steamboat Willie film that has just entered the public domain. And I get their desire to protect their business and their vain wish to protect what used to be their exclusive intellectual property, but frankly, considering the ill will they've generated in recent years and the number of box office flops they've been churning out, you'd think they'd be more inclined to generate some positive PR by not complaining and filing copyright claims and trying to sue people. But regardless, I expect these new horror movies will be terrible yet fun, just as Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey was, and just as The Mean One was, and just as all of these other public domain horror movies seem to be. The first Omen will be coming out on April 5th. That's one I'm pretty excited about. Like The Exorcist, The Omen is one of my favorite classic horror movies, and dealing with similar demonic kinds of themes. I'm talking about the original Omen, not the shot-for-shot remake that had no real reason to exist. But I'm also talking about at least some of the sequels. This new one looks like a prequel to The Omen, and I'm intrigued to see what they do with it. I just hope they don't butcher it as badly as David Gordon Green did to The Exorcist. On April 12th, we'll get to see Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire, another sequel to Godzilla vs. Kong, but this time it's not Godzilla vs. Kong because it seems like they're on the same side now. And honestly, I'm curious to see it. I expect the special effects will be spectacular, and I actually rather liked Godzilla vs. Kong a couple years ago. But here's the thing. I just saw Godzilla -1 toward the end of last year, and there's simply no way this one is going to be able to compete with that one. So I'm a bit less excited than I would have been otherwise, but I'll still be first in line at the theater when it comes out in April. April 25 brings us Return to Silent Hill, and this is another one I don't really know a whole lot about, except that it's another Silent Hill movie. I've never thought the franchise was one of my favorites, but it has given us some good movies in the past, so there's at least a decent chance this one will be worth watching. Horrorscope, coming on May 10th, is another one I don't know much about, except that it follows a group of students who start dying after getting their horoscopes read, which seems like an okay premise for a horror movie. Not the most original, perhaps, but not bad either. The sort of thing that really just depends on how well the writer, director, and cast handle it. I do have to say the title doesn't really do it for me, but that doesn't really mean much about the quality of the film itself. The Strangers, Chapter 1, is coming on May 17th. And here's another one that gives me mixed thoughts. The Strangers is a great home invasion movie. It has believable characters, real tension, some great scenes that will perhaps stick with you for quite a while, and it's perfect because it doesn't try to explain too much. I'd love to watch another movie like that. My fear, though, is that trying to build a franchise out of it is going to result in films that over-explain what the villains are up to and turn it into more of a stereotypical slasher movie just with a home invasion theme. And I think that would be exactly the wrong thing to do. So let's hope for the best, but I'm cautiously optimistic at most. The Watchers, coming out on June the 7th, is an interesting one because it's the first film written and directed by M. Night Shyamalan's daughter, Ishana. It's about somebody who is stalked by mysterious creatures each night in some isolated forest in Ireland. It sounds pretty good, but what's going to be really interesting about this one is to see whether the younger director follows in her father's footsteps or whether she carves out a unique cinematic style of her own. Could be great either way. But skipping ahead just a little bit, chronologically, in the interest of thematic continuity, August the 2nd is going to give us a new film by M. Night Shyamalan himself. Like father, like daughter, I suppose, so it's going to be a summer of Shyamalan movies. I know essentially nothing about this one, except that it's called Trap, but I think we can expect a lot of the same tricks and elements that make Shyamalan movies the movies they are and that make him the filmmaker he is, regardless of your individual thoughts about his work. Personally, I'm usually on his side, with the exception of just a couple duds that he's made, but overall I like his work and I have high hopes for both of these new Shyamalan movies. We are also getting a new Quiet Place movie called A Quiet Place Day One, and that's jumping back in our chronology or our calendar from the previous title just a little bit, and that's coming out on June 28. And I feel like a broken record saying so, but I have mixed thoughts here too. I've enjoyed the Quiet Place movies, but I also don't know if we really need another one. This one is supposed to be a prequel, so at least maybe it'll break some new ground and show us the start of this sort of monster apocalypse rather than just following people who've already become accustomed to it. But we'll have to see what they end up doing with it when it finally comes out. August 9, we'll see the release of the American remake of a movie called Speak No Evil, which was released in Denmark in early 2022 and then made it to Shudder in late 2022. And it was a pretty good movie. It divided audiences for sure, but I generally liked it. But here's the thing. We don't need an American remake. Even the original is mostly in English, with a few scenes in other languages. So there's barely even a language barrier. Not that that's ever stopped me from enjoying a foreign film. I'm perfectly capable of reading subtitles. And so I just don't see the point in making an American version of a film that was already mostly in English. And don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking my own country. Americans, particularly those outside of the Hollywood system, do make some of the best movies in the world. Not the only good movies, but plenty of good ones. However, American remakes of foreign horror movies are rarely even worth watching. There's a couple exceptions, but they're rare. And this one, Speak No Evil, just doesn't strike me as at all necessary. I've listed it on this most anticipated of 2024 list because a lot of other people have been saying it is one of their most anticipated. But I'd say just go watch the source material, which is already available. A new Alien movie is coming on August 16. This one is called Alien Romulus. And of course, despite a few weak links in the franchise, the original Alien movies are still among the finest sci-fi horror movies ever made. This new one, from what I've been able to gather, appears to be a standalone film that chronologically fits between the first two, but further details have been pretty well kept under wraps. And I have the same thoughts I keep repeating, which is that I have high hopes, but not necessarily high expectations for all of these sequels. At least this one is a standalone film featuring the Xenomorphs, so it doesn't have to worry about perfectly fitting within the continuity of its predecessors, and it doesn't really have to worry about ruining some of the stories of its predecessors, so that gives me some hope, at least, that it might be a good one. If nothing else, I suspect it'll be a special effects marvel. Beetlejuice 2 is scheduled for release on September the 6th, and of course everyone's all kinds of excited about that one. But as with all these other sequels and reboots and remakes, my optimism is a bit on the cautious and restrained side. On the positive side, some of the original cast are returning for the sequel, including Michael Keaton and Winona Ryder. Plus, they have added Jenna Ortega, one of the biggest new stars in the genre. With Tim Burton still at the helm, all of that bodes fairly well. But the question that remains to be answered is whether these characters and this story still makes sense more than 35 years later. I, for one, am pretty keen to find that out. September 29 will then see the release of Saw 11. And I have to say, if you had asked me a year ago what I thought about an 11th installment in the Saw franchise, I pretty much would have just yawned. Not that I hate the movies, I still enjoyed all of the Saw movies for what they were, but it had started to feel a little bit stale. However, after last year's Saw 10 completely exceeded everyone's expectations and became one of the best movies of the year, go back and watch my best of the year list in case you missed it, I have to say, I'm curious to see with Saw 11 whether they will continue on the current path or whether the franchise will just return to the formulaic stuff that they had been doing for the previous several films. Let's hope they give us more of the magic the last film pulled off. Smile 2 is coming on October 18th. Obviously, October is going to be one of the big months for horror movies, and after Smile turned into such a hit when it came out, I'm not surprised that they're making a sequel. Personally, I didn't really think it was the kind of film that cried out for a sequel, but I did like the first one, so we'll see whether this new installment offers anything new, or whether it's just a repeat of the previous one. Hopefully it manages to capture some of what the previous one did well, while also exploring some new ground. October 25th will see the release of 2 major horror movies. The first is, of course, one of the ones we're all excited about, and that's Terrifier 3. When Terrifier 2 came out, its box office overperformance shocked everyone and likely paved the way for a lot of the new independent horror movies we've been seeing, even at major chain theaters like AMC. For example, going back to thinking about Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey that I mentioned earlier, that played at my local AMC. Nobody saw that coming, and I think Terrifier 2 really paved the way for that. And a lot of people now are waiting to see whether the third movie in the Terrifier series can recapture some of that same magic. And honestly, I kind of think so. Writer-director Damien Leone seems to know exactly what he's doing. And even the little teaser that came out a couple of months ago managed to ignite a certain degree of controversy. So I think we should trust Damien, and I think we should be in store for another good one. The only real question is, after the hacksaw scene in Terrifier and the bedroom scene in Terrifier 2, can the Terrifier folks find a way to raise the ante even further in the next one? Personally, it's a tall order, but I think Damien might just be up to the challenge. And it's going to be interesting to see Art the Clown doing his thing and perhaps raising the bar even further, but during the Christmas season in this case, instead of the Halloween season. Also coming on October 25th is The Wolfman, Universal's latest attempt to revitalize their classic monster movies. The Invisible Man, a couple years ago, received mostly positive reviews, although I personally found it a pale imitation of the 1933 classic. Not horrible, but I'd rather watch the 1933 one. And honestly, I sort of expect the same from the new Wolfman movie. I don't think it'll be terrible, but I just don't see the current crop of Hollywood people as even capable of doing anything that could even begin to approach the work of such giants as Lon Chaney Jr. I'll be watching it anyway because I'm always wishing for more good werewolf movies, but I also rather expect the release date will be changing, because if they do release a remake of The Wolfman in direct competition with Terrifier 3, they're going to get slaughtered at the box office. Robert Eggers' remake of Nosferatu is scheduled for release on Christmas Day, which might be just about the only thing that would keep me from seeing it on day one. So, of course, that's exactly what the Hollywood people have decided to do. Go figure. But I am fairly excited to see the movie. Despite being a complete infringement of the Stoker Estate's copyright on Dracula, which resulted in a court ordering all copies of the film destroyed, surviving copies of the 1922 silent Nosferatu still saw circulation, and the film became an undeniable classic and an integral part of the cinematic horror canon. But while I generally don't like remakes, and I still think people absolutely should see Murnau's original film, I also admit that modern audiences probably need a remake of this one to rekindle their interest, and Eggers is one of the few directors I'd actually trust with a project of that magnitude. We don't have a lot of great horror auteurs anymore, but Eggers has consistently given us good to great movies. I was more excited about the film before Anya Taylor-Joy dropped out of the project, because I've liked pretty much everything she's done. But even though she's dropped out, I'm still curious to see how this one turns out. And then there are a whole slew of movies that don't have specific release dates yet, but which a lot of people think are at least likely to be released sometime this year. First among those is an untitled Jordan Peele movie that a lot of people seem really excited about. But honestly, that's pretty much the only reason I'm mentioning it, for the sake of other people, because I'm really not all that excited. I do think he's a talented filmmaker, and he's clearly one of us. By that I mean he's a real horror fan. His comedy sketches about horror are some of the best things ever. But of Jordan Peele's actual horror movies, I really only liked one of them. And it's not the one that you think. Some of them have been mediocre or maybe good but not great. But unfortunately, his latest film, Nope, which was released following the same kind of secrecy surrounding this new project, that was easily one of the 5 or 10 worst movies of 2022. So I'll watch the new one anyway, because I know Peele can make a good movie. I just keep wishing, seemingly in vain, that he would make another good movie. One I am much more excited about is Maxine, spelt with the 3 X's. This is the third in the trilogy following X and Pearl, and still starring Mia Goth as Maxine. This might be one of the genuinely most anticipated horror movies of the year, but we still don't know exactly when we'll get to see it. Whenever it does come out, I will of course be first in line, because the first 2 films, despite exhibiting vastly different cinematic styles and almost even being of different genres, were both among the very best films of 2022. One at the very beginning and one at the very end of the year. Sometime this year, we also expect Shudder to release what's been described as a minimalist horror film called In a Violent Nature. All I really know is that it features some kind of undead monster, but I have to say I've been reasonably impressed with several Shudder originals, so there's a good chance it'll be a good one. A couple days ago, Neon dropped a teaser trailer for a mystery project that most people think is actually for a film called Long Legs, a new Nick Cage film about a serial killer. If that's actually what the teaser is for, it looks delightfully creepy, and y'all know I'm a Cage fan regardless, so that should be a good one whenever it comes out. Again, presumably sometime this year, but details are sparse. And then there's the Salem's Lot remake. It was supposed to come out in 2022, but it didn't. Then Warner Brothers said they were going to release it directly to streaming on Max in 2023 because they needed more content on that service apparently due to the various strikes. But they didn't. And I suppose that's good because I really have no interest in buying yet another damn streaming service just to see a remake of a Stephen King movie. But now there's talk that it might or might not finally come out in 2024, and it might or might not have either a streaming release or a theatrical release, or maybe a DVD, or maybe not. Honestly, Warner Brothers has no damn idea what they're doing with this project. And frankly, I wasn't all that interested in another Salem's Lot remake in the first place. The 1979 film was great. The 2004 Rob Lowe remake was an abomination, and I honestly don't think Hollywood has gotten any smarter over the last 20 years, so my expectations couldn't possibly be any lower. I mean, admittedly, Stephen King saw a screener of the film apparently and said he liked it, but to be honest there, I question his taste these days too. The only reason I consider it one of my most anticipated films of the year is because at this point, it's been delayed so many times and gone through so many iterations and on again, off again, and it's going to be theatrical, then it's streaming, and then maybe there's a DVD and maybe there isn't, and all these things. At this point, I'm eagerly anticipating it simply because I'm placing wagers on whether it even comes out at all. A remake I actually do really want to see is the Toxic Avenger remake, starring Peter Dinklage of all people. I'm a Troma fan, so of course the original Toxic Avenger is great, but I do admit to being rather curious what a Troma film would look like if given a real budget and professional actors. It's been playing the festival circuit, but I think there's a very good chance we could see a wide release this year. Probably not a big theatrical release, but maybe either a DVD or a streaming service or something like that. An intriguing one that's coming soon is called Iron Lung. It's the directorial debut of a YouTuber and based on a video game of the same title, which of course I never played. So unfortunately I don't know all that much about the source material. But it does feature an apocalyptic world, a submarine, and an ocean of blood. And that sounds fascinating to me. Given its background, I have a feeling it's going to either be one of the best or one of the worst of the year with not much room for middle ground, and I'm pretty excited to find out which is going to be the case. Another YouTuber is making a movie called Shelby Oaks, which looks like a kind of haunted house story. They already have copies available for pre-order, so it looks like they are doing a physical release, which always makes me happy. Long live physical media. But it's not clear exactly when that release will be. A religious horror movie called Immaculate is potentially coming this year, and it apparently centers on a religious woman who joins a convent in Italy where she discovers something horrifying. I tend to like religious horror movies, so that one will certainly be on my list whenever more news finally reaches us. There's a chance we might see Scream 7 toward the end of this year, but honestly, who knows? The production of that film has been so fraught between casting upheavals and the various strikes that brought Hollywood to its knees. The upshot of all that is that they lost two of their stars. First, they fired Melissa Barrera for her commentary on the war between Israel and Hamas, And then Jenna Ortega dropped out, citing scheduling conflicts, perhaps caused by the aforementioned strikes, and then there were the strikes themselves. So, without their two lead actresses, it's unclear where the series is going to go, or whether we're going to get this next sequel this year or next year, or when. In fact, Deadline reported a couple months ago that they didn't even have a script because the writers weren't working at the time. So it seems like a long shot that it'll be out this year. But on the other hand, I've seen people with far fewer resources crank out movies in far less than a year, so time will tell. There's also talk that this year might see the release of a new film in the Conjuring franchise called The Conjuring: Last Rites. Its release date and production schedule are unknown, so a 2025 release might seem a bit more likely, but we do know that it's coming, perhaps this year. That's about all we know. It's unclear which of the Warrens' supposedly true cases it's going to follow, and James Wan has hinted that it could be the last of the Conjuring movies, but I think we all know that even if he's not interested in working on any more, it's not going to be the last one. There's already talk of a TV show, and even if there weren't talk of that, I have no doubt that the studios will keep cranking these out as long as people keep watching them. And despite my complicated thoughts about the franchise, I have to admit, I will be one of those people who keeps watching them. There's also a reboot of The Crow in the works, about which I know next to nothing because I don't see the point. And surprisingly enough, a new Faces of Death expected to drop at some point this year as well as a remake of Witchboard, because apparently this is the year of remakes, reboots, and sequels. In fact, looking over the list I've just read out, I'm honestly a little bit disappointed. Admittedly, even some of the sequels are high on my must-watch list. But I really want to see something original too, and it seems like everyone is just capitalizing on pre-existing properties. There are many more sequels than originals, or sequels, remakes, reboots, than originals. But we're not quite done. If we're interested in more original stories, as I was talking about, we still have a lot of upcoming books to discuss. And for all their faults, the same faults that partly motivated me to start my own publishing house, at least the publishing industry isn't quite as hog wild on remakes and sequels as the film industry seems to be. So that's where we're going now. My list of upcoming books is a bit shorter than my list of upcoming movies. And it's not that I like movies more than books, it's just those are the lengths of the lists that I ended up with. But there's still plenty of good stuff in the works for literature as well as cinema. Before I list these off, do me a favor. Make sure you've subscribed, hit that like button, and share my videos with some friends, acquaintances, family members, enemies even. Making these videos does take a fair amount of my time, so I'd really like for some more people to see them. You have my thanks in advance. But without further ado, let's go through some book releases for 2024. First up is a book called 12 Hours by L. Marie Wood, which is coming on January 11, so right about the same time as this video is getting published. But even if it may already be out by the time you see this, it's still upcoming at the time I'm filming it, so fair game. This is a novella, and the second in a series of something called the Consortium for the Study of Anomalous Phenomena, which sounds right up my alley as a member of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society. I'm still not quite sure whether consortium or society sounds better, but that may be a question for a different day. The description of this book says, and I'm quoting here, "The cabbie only remembers taking a break, pulling over in an alley to catch both his breath and the sunrise. His windshield shatters, and two people dash away. He tries to scream, to move, but his neck won't turn. He can only stare at the cab's dirty ceiling. Finally, a delivery man calls the cops. Surely they'll arrive soon, but we're pinned in place right along with him as he tries to puzzle it all out. So, it seems like we're getting a story that takes place during this single incident at this single location, and presumably, based on the title, lasts for about 12 hours. I have my guesses already as to what's happening, and if I'm right, it should be a pretty interesting one, especially if the author manages to pull off the ending. And if I'm wrong, well, then that surprises me already, and I always like being surprised by a good story. The Invocations by Crystal Sutherland is dropping on January 30. I honestly don't know a whole lot about this one, but the early chatter that I've been hearing sounds fairly encouraging. The description says, and again I'm quoting, Zara Jones believes in magic because the alternative is too painful to bear. That her sister was murdered by a serial killer, and there is precisely nothing she can do to change it. If there's anything Zara cannot stand, it's feeling powerless. So she decides she will do whatever it takes, even if that means partaking in the occult to bring her sister back from the dead. Jude Wolfe might be the daughter of a billionaire, but she is also undeniably cursed. After a deal with a demon went horribly wrong, her soul is now slowly turning necrotic. Flowers and insects die in her wake, and monstrous things come to taunt her at night. If Jude can't find the right someone to fix her mistake, she fears she'll die very soon. Enter Immer Brine, the solution to both Zara's and Jude's predicaments. The daughter of a witch, Immer sells spells to women in desperate situations, willing to sacrifice a part of their soul in exchange for a bit of power, a bit of magic to change their lives. But Immer has a dark past all her own, and as her former clients are murdered, one by one, she knows it's followed her all the way to London. As Zara and Jude enter Immer's orbit, they'll have to team up to stop the killer, before they each end up next on his list. So, I don't know whether it'll end up being more horror or more dark fantasy, but either way it sounds interesting. Among the Living by Tim Lebbon will be out on February 6th, and this is one I've been looking forward to. I've read several of Tim Lebbon's novels, and I'm generally a big fan, so I pre-ordered this one as soon as I saw him starting to talk about it. Let's start by reading the description here. From the New York Times bestseller and author of Netflix's The Silence comes a terrifying horror novel set in a melting Arctic landscape. Something deadly has lain dormant for thousands of years, but now the permafrost is giving up its secrets. Estranged friends Dean and Bethan meet after 5 years apart when they are drawn to a network of caves on a remote Arctic island. Bethan and her friends are environmental activists determined to protect the land. But Dean's group's exploitation of rare earth minerals deep in the caves unleashes a horrific contagion that has rested frozen and undisturbed for many millennia. Fleeing the terrors emerging from the caves, Dean and Bethan and their rival teams undertake a perilous journey on foot across an unpredictable and volatile landscape. The ex-friends must learn to work together again if they're to survive, and, more importantly, stop the horror from spreading to the wider world. There's been quite a bit of what we might call environmental activist horror in recent decades. Most of it is terrible because it places cause above story. And someone could be forgiven for thinking this sounds a lot like one of those, but there are a couple of reasons I'm excited about it, and I don't think it is going to be one of those annoying cause above story kinds of novels. First of all, I trust Tim Lebbon to tell a good story. I think that's the most important thing. Secondly, I think the Arctic setting is wonderful, and I'd love to read more horror that takes place in those kinds of locations. But most importantly of all, it sounds like it's crafted in such a way, and I believe that Tim Levin would craft a story in such a way, that it can explore those environmental issues without being ham-fisted about it. It sounds like we have non-villainous characters on both sides of the issue, and stories like that are where we can best explore these kinds of ideas. Murder Road by Simone St. James is coming on March 5th. This author is fairly well known, although I've never read her work before, but this novel sounds like a great horror thriller about people who pick up a mysterious hitchhiker and then get accidentally drawn into a mystery surrounding an apparent serial killer. But it also sounds like it's going to involve something supernatural. I don't know exactly what supernatural, but it has me pretty excited to see where things go. The Haunting of Velkwood by Gwendolyn Keist is also coming out on March 5. That should be an interesting day for literature indeed. Gwendolyn Keist is the author of the Stoker Award-winning novel The Rust Maidens, which I thought was an excellent book. And now this new one sounds like it's sort of a similar attempt at putting some really fresh ideas into what could otherwise be rather, I don't want to say cliched, but let's say perhaps trope heavy. This particular story is about a group of friends who are apparently the only people to survive a mysterious evening in which everyone in their neighborhood turns into ghosts. I don't think I've ever read anything that sounds quite like that, despite having read a lot of ghost stories. So I'm excited to see what it has in store for us. March 14th, Pi Day itself, is going to be a very exciting day around here. That's the day I'm planning, assuming all goes well, on releasing my next anthology, which will be called Arithmophobia, an anthology of mathematical horror. I can't announce all of the details yet because some of the contracts haven't been signed yet. It's a bit of a pet project of mine. I've wanted to read a collection of mathematical horror stories for years, since obviously I'm a horror nerd, but I also have a background in mathematics. Unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that no one else was publishing, so I've gone ahead and put it together myself. It's going to feature cover art by Keelan Patrick Burke, who I've mentioned on this channel before for his own writing, but he's also a great artist. And that cover art will be revealed soon. It has not been revealed yet. It's also going to feature a perfectly creepy 13 stories by some truly excellent authors, ranging from some first-time authors all the way to Bram Stoker Lifetime Achievement Award winner Elizabeth Massey, along with plenty of others, both known and relatively unknown. It's coming from my publishing house, which you can find at polymathpress.com, which you should be visiting regularly because that's also a great place to stay informed, not only about this, but about a bunch of exciting literary projects, including some that I can't announce quite yet. But, of course, my own book is going to be one of my most anticipated books of the year. I'd be crazy to say otherwise. The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones is expected on March 26. This is the third and presumably final entry in the Indian Lake series, which began with My Heart is a Chainsaw and followed up with Don't Fear the Reaper. Descriptions I've found haven't really said much we don't already know about what's happening in this third book, but honestly that's probably for the best because I'm not really a fan of spoilers and I don't want to say too much anyway in case some of y'all haven't read the first two novels. Suffice it to say, I've been thoroughly enjoying this series, especially the first one, but the second one was good too, and I can't wait to see where it all ends up with this third one. The House That Horror Built by Christina Henry is dropping on May 14. This one sounds like a sort of gothic novel about a single mother who takes a job working in the home of a reclusive and mysterious former horror filmmaker. But then she starts hearing voices calling for help behind locked doors, even though the house is supposed to be otherwise vacant. If it sounds like we've read that story before, it's kind of true. The Gothic novel is a rich tradition, and this one sounds very much like so many others. But taking place in the home of a horror director also makes it sound like perhaps it will do for the Gothic novel what Stephen Graham Jones and some others did for slashers, with this self-aware kind of story full of self-reference. I don't know if that's the case, but it's sort of what it sounds like to me, and that would certainly fit within the current trend of self-aware and almost self-referential horror stories that we might almost be tempted to call metafiction. It's a trend that I think is going to get really old really fast, but for now, I still think people are finding some really interesting things to do with it. April 9th will see the release of Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes. Let's just start off with the publisher's description of this one, which says, "Space exploration can be lonely and isolating. Psychologist Dr. Ophelia Bray has dedicated her life to the study and prevention of ERS, a space-based condition most famous for a case that resulted in the brutal murders of 29 people. When she's assigned to a small exploration crew, she's eager to make a difference. But as they begin to establish residency on an abandoned planet, it becomes clear that the crew is hiding something. While Ophelia focuses on her new role, her crewmates are far more interested in investigating the eerie, ancient planet and unraveling the mystery behind the previous colonizers' hasty departure than opening up to her. That is, until their pilot is discovered gruesomely murdered. Is this Ophelia's worst nightmare starting? A wave of violence and mental deterioration from ERS? Or is it something more sinister? Terrified that history will repeat itself, Ophelia and the crew must work together to figure out what's happening. But the truth is hard to come by, and the crew isn't the only one keeping secrets. So we have horror set in space featuring a psychologist. That sounds tailor-made for me in so many ways. First of all, I have some psych background myself, although I am not a professional psychologist, so that aspect is certain to be interesting. But perhaps even more important, I've talked on this channel several times about why I like nautical horror, because of the isolation and the unforgiving environment in which it takes place. Well, spacefaring horror is just a futuristic twist on basically the same thing, and I like it for largely the same reasons. Plus, I read this author's previous space-set horror novel, Dead Silence, and I thought it was a good one, so I'm keen to try out another one by the same author. April 16 brings us a new novel by Thomas Olde Huvelt called Oracle. This features a character from his breakthrough novel, Hex, though other than featuring the same character, I don't believe it's really a direct sequel. This one has to do with some people who find a mysterious ship, a sailing ship, but instead of finding it at sea, it's in a flower field. And of course, things presumably get even weirder from there. So, I don't know if this one's going to have those elements that I love about nautical horror. It does feature a ship, but I just don't know. But it is from a well-respected author, and I'm keen to try it out. Paul Tremblay has a new book coming on June 11 called Horror Movie. It's a novel about a cursed horror movie. We've all seen those movies about some low-budget cult movie that never got fully released properly. Maybe we've even seen some of those movies ourselves, particularly if you're the kind of person that likes weird cinema. And that seems to be what's at the heart of this novel. In the novel, apparently Hollywood is rebooting this movie that never got properly released, this cursed movie, and it appears the only surviving cast member is going to be the main character, and I guess he's trying to deal with it all. This one sounds a lot more like a kind of standard horror story than Tremblay is typically known for, but presumably he's got some interesting twists on the idea, and I do tend to like his work, so it should be, hopefully, a good read. Josh Malerman, best known as the author of Bird Box, also has a book coming on June 25th called Incidents Around the House. This is described by the publisher as a chilling horror novel about a haunting told from the perspective of a young girl whose troubled family is targeted by an entity she calls Other Mommy. Sounds like a good premise, and I'm keen on reading the book just because I've liked some of the author's other works. However, that Other Mommy part hits perhaps a little close to home for me and raises my interest even more because it's strikingly reminiscent of one of the true stories that will be featured in a future volume of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Case Files. I don't want to go too much into those details, but there is a story about Other Mommy in one of those investigations. As a matter of fact, if plans don't change too much, that story should be in the upcoming second volume of that series. That's nothing to do with the Malerman book, of course, but it's a funny coincidence, and I thought I would mention it. With regard to this book, it sounds like it must be some kind of demonic entity, but it should be interesting because apparently the story is told from the child's perspective, and that should hopefully make it even creepier. Amazingly enough, Stephen Graham Jones has a second book coming this year. Apparently he's been busy. This one is called I Was a Teenage Slasher, and it comes out on July 16. Jones has been exploring the slasher genre pretty heavily with his Indian Lake books that I already mentioned, and though this is another slasher, it's not part of that series. In this one, it appears we follow the story from the killer's own perspective. That's not an entirely original idea, but let's just say Jones can write some pretty disturbing stuff, so I suspect we're in for a treat reading a slasher story from the killer's perspective. Clown in a Cornfield 3, The Church of Frindo by Adam Caesar, and I did pronounce that correctly. It's not Cesare, he pronounces it Caesar. Anyway, that book comes out on August 20. I quite liked the first book in the series, Clown in a Cornfield, and I have purchased, but I have not yet read the second one. So I'm not going to be able to say too much about this third one, except to say it's been a popular series, it's been well received, and I can vouch personally for the first one. I'm reluctant to even read the description myself of this third one, in case it spoils the second one, which I haven't read yet. So I'm not going to tell you all of the details. I'm going to take the next several months to get up to speed before this third volume comes out. Nick Cutter has a book called The Queen, coming on August 28. I'm really curious about this one. So far, I've read 2 books by this author before. One of them I loved, and one of them really didn't do anything for me at all. So I'm keen to at least try one more, and I want to see which one was the fluke. Is he a great author and just had one that didn't do it for me, or is his work not for me? I'm going to try one more, and we're going to see which way it goes. The description for this one says, on a sunny morning in June, Margaret Carpenter wakes up to find a new iPhone on her doorstep. She switches it on to find a text from her best friend, Charity Atwater. The problem is, Charity's been missing for over a month. Most people in town, even the police, think she's dead. Margaret and Charity have been lifelong friends. They share everything, know the most intimate details about one another. But Charity carries a secret that even she is unaware of, a secret engraved into her DNA helix. For Charity is also known as Subject 6, the crown jewel of Project Athena, a clandestine and unorthodox gene manipulation experiment, the brainchild of tech titan Rudyard Crate. And when Charity's gene sequencing actualizes during a traumatic event at a high school party, it sets in motion a chain of events that will end in tragedy, bloodshed, and death. And now, Charity wants Margaret to know her story. The real story. In a narrative that takes place over one feverish day, Margaret follows a series of increasingly dreadful breadcrumbs as she forges deeper into the mystery of her best friend, a person she never truly knew at all. So we've got some sci-fi horror that sounds like something I'd rather enjoy. And as I said, I'm really curious to see how it compares to the author's other books and see whether I like this one or not. But we're not quite finished. There's one more book that I'm super excited about that should be coming this mid-September. A lot of you probably already know it's in the works, but I'm pleased to announce that, again, assuming all goes according to plan, Case Files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society, Volume 2 by myself and Brian Bonner should be coming this autumn, most likely launching at or at least around the Colorado Festival of Horror in September. I don't want to say too much about what's in this second volume right away, but just to sort of tease it a little bit, it's going to have some haunted mansions, some murders, and some aliens. And I think you're not going to want to miss it. I've been humbled by the amazing response to the first volume, so I'm really excited for y'all to see Volume 2 when it finally comes out. Okay, that's the last book I'm highlighting for now, though I'm sure there will be plenty more I'll discover, or rediscover perhaps, as the year goes on. This also seems like a good opportunity to remind you to head on over to polymathpress.com, where you can get autographed copies of Volume 1 of Case Files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society, as well as sign up to my mailing list so you'll hear about Volume 2 and, in fact, all of the various updates of the things that I'm writing and publishing as they happen. In the meantime, as this video suggests, I've got plenty of books to read and movies to watch, so all things considered, hopefully it should be a pretty good year for all of us, at least when it comes to the horror genre. Stay tuned for my next video, in which I look back at all the books I read last month, and then we'll move forward this year with lots and lots of great new videos on what I plan to be a more regular publishing schedule. And so all that remains now is for me to say, as always, take care and stay scared.